Welcome to the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective. I'm Tony Aguilar. Climate change and global warming remain a clear and present danger to the planet. The biggest contributor to global warming is the use of fossil fuels, which, according to the United Nations, accounts for over 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions and nearly 90% of all carbon dioxide emissions. Nonetheless, while 97% of the world's scientists agree about the dangers faced because of climate change, too often the issue is mired in politics and corporate profits. As the Earth's temperature continues to increase, can this trend be reversed or is it too late? Global warming, a clear and present danger. Next. Joining me today is Jeff Ordower, the North America Director for 350.org, an international grassroots organization who, in their words, is working to dismantle the influence and infrastructure of the fossil fuels industry and to power up clean systems rooted in justice. Jeff, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Tony.
Let me start off by this. In terms of this campaign and the challenges that we are facing in terms of global warming and climate change, where are we right now, in your opinion, for what you're seeing?
Yeah, we are in danger and there is some hope. And let me put it a little bit of context. So the whole world has acknowledged the problems with climate change for the last 30 years. Has been meeting since Kyoto to talk about that. That's a significant step forward. There are very few things that the entire world is unified on. Where things are harder is the how, right? We're talking about changing 200 or 300 years of development since the Industrial Revolution. So that's the problem. But we are trying to face it together and collectively. However, the science of what's happening, the earth warming, the oceans warming, the more, the catastrophic climate events are making things much, much challenging. So we are facing a clock and we need to move quickly. Where we're excited about is that there's sort of a two-pronged fight against this. The first is folks really doing a significantly good job of fighting the bad, both pulling financing from extraction, forcing even some of the major oil and gas companies to have build out their renewable portfolios. And then also this movement that we're part of to build the solutions that we need to build a significantly different economy. So I think there's some hope, but we've got to move fast, we've got to be bold, and we've got to be much bigger and more effective than we've been.
So, with that, with what you're putting out, is some progress being made since the Kyoto Agreement and Paris Agreement. Where do the challenges remain?
Yeah, the largest challenge is just, and I think a lot of us don't put it enough in perspective about the history of how the world is moving. So if we're really going to change, create renewable economies for the planet, that is about trying to undo some 400 years of colonialism and imperialism to start, right? We've still got financial systems that extract from the global south to the global north and trillions of dollars in debt, and also see extraction, right? Actually taking raw materials and moving them from south to north as a huge means of profit. So that's sort of the first thing is we've got to change that. We've got to change the way money moves and investment happens so that everyone can convert to renewable energy, and that's viable, not just for energy itself, but it's related to a system where there's more prosperity throughout the world and folks can, meet their basic needs wherever they are in the world. So it's related to poverty. It's related to these larger systems of capitalism. That's the first thing. And the first challenge is that piece of history. The second thing is whether we can build the power and the people enough to create a different economy. And there's some complexity in the different systems of renewable energy. And there's a lot of complexity in that, right? We're fighting some powerful targets in the US. We're fighting utility companies that have monopolies. We're fighting the largest companies in the world, the oil companies. Um, and part of that is there's two parts of this. The first is how we create systems to convert, but the second is how we think about that in a way that benefits everyone and does have us change some of how we live and work. And that's important to know. We can't just build a whole bunch of electric vehicle SUVs. We're going to need to really ramp up public transportation. We're going to need to think about doing things closer to home, many of us. And there'll be benefits to that. There'll be a lot more leisure time if we build it right.
Now, who has allied with you on this issue? I know that there's been a lot of pushback against corporations that have been promoting what they're doing in terms of the green economy. Um, but who has been allied with you? Who's standing with you in this fight?
Yeah, I think, well, the interesting thing, so I think we're talking about the US context for a second, is with the Inflation Reduction Act, which does put hundreds of billions of dollars in play for a conversion, there's actually been more investment up till now in red states and red congressional districts than there has been in blue ones. So I think if we're thinking about the big picture and taking a step back, the range of alliances is pretty broad in terms of where there's development for electric vehicles, for batteries, for solar, for wind. There's a lot of room there. There's a lot of potential allies. Um, and so I think actually our allies are a lot bigger and broader than we think. I also think there's like some of the old things that we say conventional wisdom is no longer true, right? So we're saying, oh, unions are in the way. They're actually not. They understand there's a transition. They want to make sure that there are jobs on the other side, that actually being a wind turbine technician is just as good for sustaining your family as, drilling on an oil platform. And that's what we need to make sure. But there's no inherent barrier to that through the labor movement, for example. So the labor movement is our ally, and we've seen this in the massive changes in the labor movement in the U.S. with United Auto Workers' new leadership and what they've been able to do in contract negotiations, creating a pathway to unionization for electric vehicle plants, for battery plants, and the commitments from the big three. So the labor movement is our ally, community organizations. And then I think this is when we get into the weeds on the Inflation Reduction Act, we're going to see that everyone wants some level of investment. And there's a lot more allies than we think. And that what we're trying to do is combat this disinformation from some sectors of the right that are going to try to torpedo this bill.
Let me touch on that since you brought it up. The issue of disinformation. I remember about a year ago, maybe a year and a half ago, the World Climate Declaration, which was 1,200 people that signed on to this document that said that climate change is not an emergency. Now, most of the people that signed on to that document were not scientists. They were actually, many of them were lobbyists for the fossil fuels industry and the like, but they were not people that had scientific background. So, my question to you is how do you fight disinformation, which goes on a lot and is not only emanating from the United States, if we want to use the US as kind of a base point, but also it's imported in from other nations as well who are trying to do things with the United States system. But how do you fight disinformation?
Yeah, with good old-fashioned organizing. Um, I think people, while some people live in their, it's been tough coming out of the pandemic where people are pretty atomized and not used to being with each other. And I think what's exciting for us and why I came to work at 350 is we're a global organization in 28 countries with over 500 local groups. So those are predominantly volunteers, whether they're in Kenya or whether they're in Colombia, or whether they're in the United States, who are getting together, talking with their neighbors, with their friends, with their coworkers about what it is that we need to do to have a different kind of economy, a different kind of transition. And we're one group of many that are building a global movement, right? We see this on the youth side with Fridays for Future or the Sunrise Movement in the US. So what it really is we are getting back to building the muscle of the human contact, of being together, of talking to each other and helping people really think things through. And that's what's going to combat disinformation, is the conversations, the real experience. So in the US context and the conversion, it is going to be, if you're getting your faith institution to install solar panels, if you're getting your city hall to do that, if you're getting your school district to do that, that's the kind of thing that we can all do together. And that's what's going to combat the misinformation. And, we're talking about huge numbers of poor school districts that don't have air conditioning and are in classes as the climate heats. But even, I remember being a kid, right? There's like, you probably do too, right? So you're in school in September and it's 100 degrees and you can't
Yeah.
concentrate. What did I have? I was like the English wing. That was, you wanted an English class because that's where the air conditioning was, right? This like small set of classrooms. Um, so I think it's doing that work together, and our challenge is to be able to do that at scale, to do that with each other. But I think the level of organizing and engaging folks is what's going to counter the disinformation and real life versus what lives online.
Aided State 350.org is in 28 different countries. And I want to talk about that for a moment because one of the largest emitters in the world, obviously, is China.
Yep.
And I want to talk about how does the structure of governance in various nations make it harder or easier for organizations such as yourself to campaign against the usage of fossil fuels. So, particularly as nations go towards authoritarianism, whether it's Hungary or Turkey, Venezuela, and India, depending upon who you talk to, how do you operate in settings such as that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we don't, there's a set of, we're in a set of countries for a certain set of reasons. Partially, some of it is where we think we can operate as a people-powered movement. Um, we also think as those countries move, then as the countries where we can move them move, there it's an interconnected world. Others are going to follow. Others are going to follow suit. Um, Authoritarianism and sort of reducing emissions and carbon are not also not inherently juxtaposed, right? Some of the more interesting, right? China's a world leader around renewable energy. Um, so I think it's not as simple as authoritarian countries. I would actually put out a different premise, which is, if we're talking from the point of who are the, I don't know if you want to call them petrostates, or who are the largest sources of production, because also those who are emitting and those who are producing is also a different piece, right? Where are we drilling for oil? Um, I think the largest problem that we have to combat as a world is that this history, as I said before, colonialism and imperialism, that if you're a government and you're trying to feed your people, and the wealth that you have is your oil wealth or your minerals, that's a tough position. And that's where we need collective effort. And the fact that we work in the countries that control a lot of the global financial systems, the US and some of the major European countries, that matters whether a Brazil, Petrobras, the state-owned oil company in Brazil, can begin to convert um, to renewables, because there's an alternate source for them to get the income that they need. So I think that's the way I would think about it. Um, and certainly we want, you know, but it's, yeah, it's definitely a complicated situation, and we're working in the places that we absolutely can work, which is what the US does as we still fancy ourselves as the world's most significant superpower. That really matters. Um,
If you can say a little bit more, because the US, as a leader in global finance, in terms of how money is dispersed, to other nations through the World Banks, so forth and so on. Um, how do you combat that to make sure, as you just said, that a nation that's looking to feed its people, even though a lot of those nations, even with the oil revenue, don't wind up feeding their people, they wind up doing other things with it. But how do you get a nation like the United States and also the EU, which, if you stay within the context of colonialism, also has a responsibility to help these nations move away from fossil fuels? So, what's been the strategy for 350.org, let's say in the United States, to assist nations to move off of that, to help move money, let's say, to help them kind of reorient their economies, for lack of a better phrase?
Yeah, we haven't done that. The US hasn't done that successfully. There's a long way to go. So I'll start with that. That's the clear lead. I want to talk about a specific campaign to start with that I think is emblematic of the kind of fights that we need to be waging, and then talk a little bit more about sort of the bigger systems at play. So our groups and many others in Africa have been fighting this the East African crude oil pipeline, which is running through Tanzania and Uganda. The main culprit or beneficiary or owner of that pipeline is Total Energies, headquartered in Paris, right? So again, French oil company deciding what they're going to do in East Africa. So us being able to both have a French team that is working against Total, that is going to shareholder meetings, while also trying to get financial institutions to pull out, so significant banks to pull out of their investments in ECOP, is what the East African crude oil pipeline is known, is incredibly significant. I think we're up to now 24, 25 banks that have pulled out. And now we're starting to target the insurance companies, and just had an insurance company a couple of weeks ago pull out. So that's a piece of very specific work that we can do in the North. That's about US institutions, it's about European institutions to say, don't invest, don't do those things. We've had some great success being able to do that. So that's a specific level of where we're fighting project to project, and we can have some wins. Then you're asking about the US in a bigger context, which is, yeah, it is unfortunate that the US is still naming the head of the World Bank, that the US still defines not the world in terms of mutual interest, but in terms of the US's self-interest, and particularly the interest of the largest banks, of the largest private equity funds, in terms of what's happened. And we speak out against how the World Bank process works. We're speaking out around the G7, the G20, all of these all of the spaces. And we're starting to see a trickle of progress, right? The fact that the US agreed to, loss and damages, even if it was a paltry amount at the last COP, is significant. We know going into this year to the COP, this is the finance COP. So we hope we can build on some of those gains, but we are absolutely cognizant that that we need to be moving, that the Biden administration has an opportunity to do more than they've been doing. And we've been, one of many, many groups putting a lot of pressure on that, understanding kind of the geopolitical situation there. And then obviously there's a set of groups that are fighting directly and connecting the dots, who are fighting the largest banks, the largest private equity funds in the world, to make sure that they're changing their practices as well.
Now, in staying with that for a moment, one of the things that 350 has been able to do, 350.org has been able to do, is raise awareness of the issue. But the issue in of itself, because even with the president's Inflation Reduction Act, which is a misnomer in of itself, because it doesn't really highlight the notion of what will happen in terms of climate change or what it will do to affect climate change. So it's kind of it's been used, that term is as a veneer, so that people don't really attack it from the right. But
Yep.
how do you get folks to really understand the severity of the challenge that we are facing when it comes to global warming? The oceans are getting warmer. We know that because the oceans used to be able to reflect or to intake a lot of the carbon dioxide and the emissions, but the seas are getting too warm now. So how do you create kind of this? How do you get people to understand that it is indeed a crisis? I mean, how do you do that?
Well, I think people understand that it's a crisis, but because the crisis is so immense, they're less clear on what they can do about it. And I also think that where we need to be moving away from is this notion we have to give people more complicated answers than we're used to giving them. So traditionally, we've said, okay, if make this phone call and you vote, you can do something. And people aren't dumb. They know like we're not going to solve climate crisis by going out and voting, because as you pointed out, the limitations of the Inflation Reduction Act, the limitations of the Democratic Party, even the whole Democratic Party isn't unified on climate change. There are many fossil fuel Democrats. And that just participating in the system as it currently exists is insufficient. And so we need to be doing two different things that are different. One, provide people really local ways to get involved in the fight and the struggle. And I came to work at 350 and I was excited to be here because there's 500 local groups around the world who are working on different things in any given day. And so 116 groups in the US. So you can be part of a campaign against your gas company in Washington State or in Vermont, or you can be pushing your city council to divest in Chicago, or you can be involved in a myriad of ways at every step that really is a concrete fight against some of the powerful companies, whether those are financial institutions that you're trying to get to change, or whether those are your utility companies that are in the way of a transition and overcharging people. You can get involved every day in that fight and in that struggle. And now increasingly, where we're taking advantage of IRAs to help people think about their city governments, their, like I said before, their faith institutions, how they move them and how they make a real change. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, I think people understand that there is a significant level of commitment that we're going to have to make. And increasingly, folks are willing to do that. Um, so our one of our leaders, in 350 Charlotte, for example, was one of the folks. There's some very brave folks who have been resisting the Mountain Valley Pipeline in Virginia and West Virginia. And one of our leaders is doing 60 days in jail right now. He's towards the end of his time trying to stop the pipeline. That he put his body in the path of the construction and state repression. That's not a simple thing. That's not like going and lobbying. That's like a serious charges. And he's gladly, I mean, not 100% gladly. I'm sure the day to day is incredibly hard from what we're seeing from his reports, but he understands what's at stake, and and there are many others that are joining him in resisting the pipelines and doing the other things that need to be done despite the consequences. So you're seeing the second thing, which I think an increased level of commitment for folks in the fight, despite the repression, despite the repercussions because of that. So I think that's the pathway. People understand the severity, and our task now is to get more and more people through those pipelines of increased commitment and those pipelines of local work that is commensurate, that they can then see if we can convert our city, we can build out robust public transportation, if we can solarize, if we can change some of the economic situation of folks so that people, you're not driving, you have what you need, you can pay your utility bills, then we can make a difference, and we're one of 200 places in the US that can then make that transition. So that's our challenge before us.
I want to talk a little bit about the intersectionality of this issue, because if you look at it, there are many facets to it that people may not understand. One is that there are projections that by 2060 we may have depleted our oil reserves. So on the one hand, you have a situation in which you're going to have to find a new alternative anyway, because you're not going to have enough oil by 2060 to support a growing world population. The other thing is in terms of global warming, in terms of just things, let's say, there's a big push now on electric vehicles. You can talk to a person's self-interest, but a person can say, even with tax credits, I can't afford a an electric vehicle. So tell me how going beyond the extinction of the species, which is obviously existential in itself, but how do you speak to people about their self-interest in this issue, even if they don't understand the the crisis that it may lead to the extinction of the species if we don't do something. But that's something that's pretty broad and beyond a lot of people's understanding and comprehension, and quite frankly, what they actually believe as well. So how do you get to connect this to their self-interest on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, the major way in which we're pursuing this, and again, there's lots of groups with different strategies in the US is around utilities. That we believe that utility companies are the biggest obstacle, not just to the renewable energy economy that we need, but also to economic justice. So let's start with the intersectionality. Um, Utility bills are through the roof. Everyone is facing, whether they're paying more money for air conditioning in the summer, depending on where you live, or not paying for it because they can't afford it, right? The number of senior citizens who die every year because they don't have the money to run their air conditioning is just absolutely criminal. Um, and people can't pay their bills. They're choosing between heat and food as prices increase. And utility companies are, in most cases, regulated monopolies, which means they're guaranteed a rate of profit to their shareholders, which is just absurd. So if you can contrast, let's say, private utilities with public utilities, right? The CEO is making 10 times as much, senior management's making 10 times as much. The shareholders are guaranteed profit, and that doesn't need to happen. The second thing is utility. So people understand their material interests, right? My utility bills are through the roof. It is a reason why it is a factor why I'm facing eviction, or I can barely make my house payments, and folks absolutely understand that, and that matters. But it also matters for climate change, right? Utility companies, in addition to that, want to keep building power plants, and they want a grid that they control. And the most interesting thing about the conversion to renewable is as we scale up rooftop solar, utilities aren't going to get to have that control. Um, it's going to be more, there can be community choice, there can be community solar, but also people can control their own energy and become more and more independent from the grid. And obviously the monopolies don't like that. They want to keep their monopoly. And so they're the biggest organizations, companies in the way of that transition. And they're blocking not just rooftop solar from getting on the grid, but they're also deciding to block the larger projects, the wind and solar projects that they don't control. They're preventing them from getting the permits. They're preventing them from getting hooked up to the grid. And so the point is what is actually good for the planet is also good for people's pocketbooks. And those are the villains that we need to be calling out. And, these aren't, I mean, we talked about the millions of dollars they're making. These are global conglomerates. Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway owns a whole bunch of utility companies, right? We're not talking about some people who live in your town who are, producing your power as they'd like you to believe. A lot of them keep local names so that you think that they're actually your friendly neighborhood utility company, but really they're, you know, controlled by Warren Buffett.
So then the question becomes, why isn't that more of an issue? Because I'm hearing you speak about it. And I think, as you just said, we can all um, sympathize with one another in terms of the cost of utilities and what costs in the wintertime and the summertime. But why isn't that more of an issue right now? Because that seems to be something that's underneath the surface, but it seems to be something that people would resonate with quite readily, particularly during a time when inflation is the talk of the town, so to speak. So why isn't that more of an issue?
Well, I think you're seeing an upsurge in people thinking about how to contest against utilities. But we just saw an election in November in Maine where there was an opportunity to vote to take over the two utility companies in Maine and create Pine Tree Power, sort of a nonprofit utility. It lost. It was outspent 40-1, but the fact that they felt like they had to spend $40 million to beat it in a state like Maine was significant. So I think you are starting to see that there is a level of organizing that's coming into play. I will say one of the reasons why utilities hasn't been talked about is because people were facing and still are serious housing costs and shortages both in the pandemic and before that, right? People's income getting cut, just the shortage of housing in the US, particularly on the coasts, and people struggling to keep up with those costs, has meant that utilities are a contributing factor. But really, if you're trying to stave off eviction or if you're trying to stave off foreclosure, we're in 15 years of this housing crisis, where 11 million families were foreclosed on with the first financial collapse, then the fight for housing, while related to the fight for utilities, sometimes supersedes that. And so that's another reason why we're not seeing that as much. And we see it as our role to support and work hand in hand with those groups that are fighting for housing justice, that are fighting to stave off evictions, so that it's a more comprehensive campaign. But I think that's why we're not seeing the level of conversation, but it's growing. More and more people are becoming aware of the pernicious role that investor-owned utilities are playing.
I want to go global again for a moment. As you know, this year COP24 will be taking place in Azerbaijan, which has received some criticism, particularly from the right, particularly the American Enterprise Institute, because of their human rights violations. But nonetheless, and also it's a place where many people believe that it's ecologically the most devastated place on earth. Nonetheless, what do you hope to see happen as a result of the upcoming COP meeting?
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting dilemma, just like, what do you do when a set of more petrostates are running the COP process? On the one hand, where we started is the fact that the whole world is coming together, so you can be a petrostate and host COP means that you, at least to some degree, are invested in some process of a transition, potentially. That's sort of the way to look at it, your glass half full. Um, and this year's COP and is the finance COP. But really, I think what happens at COP by itself is insufficient. And the way to think about it is the road through COP or through any particular COP and beyond. So what we can do as a people-powered movement in 28 countries, what others can do is about setting the tone before COP, is about pushing. The next COP is in Brazil, COP 30, and that's very exciting. And the level of civil society and the level of dissent and the level at which people who are iconic and impacted in the Amazon are going to be featured in that COP has us think about, it's less what happens this year and it's more about what happens over the next year and a half leading into Brazil, where there'll be a lot of room for civil society, but also the way in which we set the tone with what we do before and after. And for us, the level of pressure, in every country on their administrations to make sure they're coming in to COP as much as they can, being ready to see this as a really, really, the US really increasing their contributions to loss and damage fund or climate reparations fund is absolutely significant and existential, and that needs to happen in France and Germany and a whole bunch of other places. So I think we have put too much into the COP basket, and that's insufficient. And we need to be building the people-powered movements outside of it while recognizing that COP is the place where the deal gets sealed for that next year, but it's not the place where the pressure happens that creates the political will for whatever deal is put on the table to be, fashioned, so shall we say.
Let's take that for a moment and a step further. It is insufficient in terms of its ability to make long lasting change, but it is a point of organizing in the sense of here's a date, here's what's supposed to happen. What will 350.org do to, let's say, organize its people, not necessarily to go to COP, but to use that as a point in order to go out into their various communities to talk about climate change, to talk about global warming, and just to use that as a starting point for conversation with people within the United States, but also people around the world.
Yeah, well, first of all, we will be at COP, and our teams from the Pacific, from Africa, usually from Japan and Asia, have been absolutely critical in being, part of social movements that are lending a moral voice and authority to the COP process. So there'll be some folks will be inside, some folks will be outside. We'll continue to be doing that. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is, there's again, I think highlighting Brazil and the year and a half that we have planned and thinking about both our Brazil team and what we can do to influence what happens at the 30th COP, which is really important, and how we're transitioning and how we're really putting pressure on. So COP is a date or dates around which we can plan and create benchmarks. People have to be there to make sure that the process is moving, and it's woefully insufficient. And I think the outside organizing that we're doing, if we are coming into COP in a year and a half with 200 campaigns around the world against utility companies and for renewable energy, that's a different way to come into COP than if we're coming into COP merely as policy-driven technocrats who are arguing where there's a clear power imbalance. So we have to change those power relationships by running the campaign so that if you're coming in and you're in Colombia, you're in Kenya, you're in Senegal, you're seeing actually people on the ground moving in a certain way, and particularly in the global north, in the US and Europe, in a way in which you're seeing local organizing that is demanding renewables combined with a real policy orientation towards the financial systems. That's going to change how our delegates and how our governments are moving coming into COP.
One topic that we really did not touch on, but I think we have to, since you are the director for North America. In November, we face an election, a presidential election.
Yeah.
So, how are you gearing up for that, and what could be a potential change of administrations? It's a real um, chance that that could happen. Number one, what's your feeling that if there is a change in administration, and two, how are you gearing up for it in terms of in terms of putting the issue on the docket and making it a major point of contention for the two parties to discuss?
Yeah, first of all, we work very closely with sibling organization 350 Action. And we know that 350 Action is going to be working with many of our state groups, especially in Wisconsin, to do what they can around in critical battleground states. We also know that many supporters of 350 Action, like many groups, are going to be in motion, and they're going to be traveling to battleground states to knock on doors and talk to people. So we're very clear about that. We're very clear it's a critical election. We're very clear that we're both pushing Biden to be the best he can be because we think that's important for his reelection, that young people care about what he's going to be doing around climate, that the liquefied natural gas pause in the Gulf is important. All of that, declaring climate emergency, all of those things are really important, both for his reelection prospects, but also for the planet. So we also know that the election might not go the way we want it to go. You were talking about authoritarianism earlier. We're both making preparations to make sure that there's not, with many, many groups in the ecosystem in the US who care about there not being, continuing to have some of the pieces of democracy that we have and to continue to have what we've got. And so folks are planning and trying to think that through. So that's sort of one piece, is like, how do we make sure that while we may disagree with the next administration, if it's coming, that it's not an authoritarian one? And what are the levels of risk and fight that we're going to need to show? The second thing is around policy, which is interesting things that it will be really hard. A lot of federal policy is going to get overturned or changed. I know the Biden administration is thinking about how they can lock some things in. Um, and I think some of the contestation will move to the states, right? We've seen, California has the eighth largest economy in the world. And so the level that they play, what they decide to do in becoming more of a leader around climate, could be significant if there's a next Trump administration. So we're not going to give up pushing, and we're going to try to figure out the places that we can go and the organizing that we can do that we think sets the tone. So when, if California is considering how they're going to deal with auto emissions, for example, that changes how the markets work. And that we also know that there's a whole set of, corporations and government are intertwined, but they also make decisions separately. So we need to continue to fight to change corporate behavior. And we do think that that the investment and gains of the Inflation Reduction Act, as we saw with the previous Trump administration's inability to eliminate Obamacare, we'll probably see something similar with the Inflation Reduction Act too. There's just too much money flowing, and we need to figure out how to best utilize that.
In the moments we have left, I want to touch again on the issue of intersectionality. Politics in and of itself requires partners and allies and the like. But when you talk about intersectionality, where are you in terms of creating those partnerships with communities that are overly affected by climate change, such as communities of color? So, where is the intersectionality with organizations like NAACP, Urban League, but also women's organizations, Latino organizations, Asian American organizations? How is that being done to create kind of this very broad based grassroots movement?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. We see it as critically important that our members, our supporters, are in clear solidarity and relationship with Indigenous folks and Indigenous organizations in the US, with frontline organizations who are facing the brunt of climate change. It's, I could name a whole bunch of there are a whole bunch of organizations and formations that those are absolutely critical relationships for us to be in. It's really important for us to be following the lead of groups in the Gulf, for example, who are at the front lines and really doing, putting out the message, doing the work that they're asking us to do. So that's like a specific example over the last couple of months. We're very clear on that. The second thing is, I think, making sure that our campaigns have a lens towards justice, which is why when I'm talking about utilities, it's not about whether or not X utility company is creating more ability for there to be rooftop solar. It's also about the prices that people are paying for their utilities, the horrible profits, and the fact that families are risking getting cut off. That's the justice we're talking about. Those are predominantly communities of color that are facing the brunt of that because of the way economic inequality works in the US. And we're very clear about that. And we're very clear the role we have to play in creating campaigns themselves that are intersectional, because otherwise we're not building the economy, the world, and the country that we need to build.
My guest today has been Jeff Ordower, North American Director for 350.org. Jeff, I want to thank you for joining me today.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me and asking really the fundamental questions that we need to get at. Thanks so much, Tony.
And join us again next week as we discuss another issue of global importance here on the Aguilar Conversations, a global perspective.
The Aguilar Conversations, A Global Perspective, is produced by Casa Margo Communications Group.